Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Seed Talk. My name is Layne, and today's episode is actually going to be part 2 of our conversation with Jonathan Leiss of Springforth Farm in Hurdle Mills, North Carolina, USDA Zone 7. In our previous episode, we talked about Jonathan's unique spring-focused business model, the role tunnels play in that model, as well as some special considerations for growing in tunnels, which is how Jonathan and his wife Megan grow all the flowers we're discussing in these episodes. We also covered 2 of the 7 cool season annual crops Jonathan will be growing next year, and those were snapdragons and scabiosa. Today we have the remaining 5 flowers, 3 seed-grown crops, and 2 corms. This podcast is sponsored by the Gardener's Workshop, so if you have a need for any seeds, tools, supplies, or online courses, hop on over to thegardenersworkshop.com and check it out. All right, let's jump back into our conversation with Jonathan. Enjoy! All right, now we're going to move on to Orlaya. This is also known as white lace flower, and this is an umbel. Why is this an important crop to your farm, and why is it worth the tunnel space?
So this is important because the demand for it is just infinite. We'll be harvesting at our maximum ability. So we can be harvesting 50 or 60 bunches a week, and we'll sell out every week. We would grow more of it, but we can't, we just don't have time to harvest more of it than that. So it's just, the demand is amazing. It's a gorgeous flower, and it also blooms fairly early for the umbel flowers, so we really like that. And it's very cold hardy. I think it may be the most cold hardy. So if you live in a more northern environment, that's also a good idea. As for why it's worth the tunnel space, it is much, much taller in the tunnel than in the field. And what that does is make all the side shoots taller, and so you can sell them. So Orlaya is naturally not that tall. Like it's not nearly as tall as Ami or Daucus. And so a lot of the side shoots in the field are too short to sell. But when the primary Orlaya flower is 36 inches high, then all those, you don't have to cut all the way down to the ground, and then you can get all these nice tall side shoots that are still perfectly sellable, 24 inches tall, which is basically the stem length we're normally going for. So we like growing this in the tunnel because the yield is so high.
And why do you like this umbel flower more than something like Ami or Daucus?
So, trying not to laugh, I would not recommend that anybody grow Ami Visnaga, Ami Majus, or Daucus in a tunnel. We tried it. Just like the Orlaya, they grew really tall. Okay. So tall that we couldn't harvest them. I mean, they were like 12 feet tall. And you're looking up, trying to figure out like which stem is on which flowers. And then additionally, the flowers themselves grew really big. So we have like Ami flowers that were 10 inches across, and nobody wanted those. So, yeah.
That is really interesting. So which variety of Orlaya do you like to grow?
We grow a variety called white lace. I know there are other varieties. This is, I think when we started growing it, that was the variety we had access to, and we've been happy with it. So we've never tried something else. I suspect other varieties might bloom a little bit earlier or later. And so that could be a reason to grow more than one variety, but we've never felt the need to do that.
All right. How do you space this in the tunnel?
We space it every 8 inches. So 3 rows, 8 inches apart. They're pretty big plants. They're very bushy, so they tend to get tangled with each other. So that spacing has worked really well for us. And most people probably know this, but this is a crop you should direct seed. We direct seed this around our last frost date, and then it's very slow to germinate, so don't lose heart. It can take 3 weeks to germinate, but once it comes up, it grows really well. Also, if you have rabbits, they do like this crop a lot.
Well, it is in the carrot family, and it does have a carroty look to the foliage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so can you describe the plant's production habit in terms of cut and come again or one and done? And also, do you plant successions?
So it makes several stems per plant, but it doesn't regrow. So right. I don't know exactly how you would call that. It makes several stems per plant, and they bloom over a 2.5 week period. So we do plant successions. We plant one in October. We plant one in January, and because we have a gap in between when those two bloom, we're going to try planting one in early December. We don't know how that'll pan out, but we're hoping just to be able to spread our harvest out more that way.
And because of the extra heat in the tunnels, you can have success direct seeding at a time when you might not if you were trying to do it out in the field.
Absolutely. So we will direct seed things in the tunnel in January and make sure they're well watered. And we figure they'll just germinate when it's the right time for them to germinate.
Yeah.
But we would never be able to do that in the field, maybe until March. I think they can take 4 or 5 weeks to germinate that time of year, but they do come up and have a good stand.
And when do you typically expect to have Orlaya blooming in your tunnels?
The first planting bloomed, I think, in early April. The January planting bloomed around Mother's Day. I think, depending on the year, it could be done just before Mother's Day, or it could start just after Mother's Day, depending on when the weather was and when Mother's Day was that year. But then there's a gap in between those two. So that's why we're going to try that third planting and see if we can fill that gap.
You already kind of mentioned this, but how many stems do you expect to get per plant?
We got 7 stems per plant. And like I said, that's just, you would never get that many in the field because they would be too short.
Yeah, that's a lot. And do you have any harvesting tips? This is one that we hear a lot from people that they have issues with it wilting. What stage do you like to harvest it at?
If you look at the center of the Orlaya flower, there's these little tiny florets. And when a ring of those is open and you can see the pollen, that's when we like to harvest it. I would say that we try to harvest it early in the morning. We strip off most of the foliage. We put it in a hydrating solution in our cooler right away. So it is just one that you may have to coddle a little bit. You can let it open more on the plant and it will be less prone to wilting. But we like to harvest things fairly early, and it does keep developing and eventually it can start shedding pollen. So that's why we like to pick it fairly early.
All right, now we're moving on to Foxglove, also known as digitalis. We always like to do a disclaimer that this plant is poisonous. All parts of the plant are poisonous, so just use caution if you're planting it around children or pets. Why is Foxglove an important crop for your farm, and why is it worth the tunnel space?
Well, Foxglove, the very first stems it puts out are just enormous.
Yes.
If you're on YouTube, you can see how big these stems are. And those initial stems, we just get such a high dollar per stem for those stems that makes it worth growing. We're trying to get those first stems and get them out the door. There's very high demand for it because it blooms during event season, and it's a great big honking spike that's just perfect for events.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And you told me before that you like to grow the Camelot variety, which for anyone listening, that's a first-year flowering variety. It doesn't need vernalization. Why do you like to grow Camelot, and which colors do you like to grow?
Any of them, all of them, they're all beautiful.
They are.
We like Camelot because it's the tallest. Another good first-year flower variety is Dalmatian.
Yes.
It's not as tall and it had more deformed stems, but it's still very productive. We're still going to keep growing it because it has some peach apricot colors that aren't available in Camelot.
And you just grow it as an annual. You don't leave the plants in to produce for another season.
That's correct. And we don't grow any varieties that need a cold spell. Those are much larger plants. We couldn't fit them in as densely. And also we'd have to start them earlier during our summer break. So we're not ready to be starting plants at that time.
And did you ever grow Foxglove in the field? And if so, what were the differences you noticed in the tunnel versus the field?
We did grow it in the field. It was much shorter. So that was the biggest difference. That's a general theme with all of the crops. However, on top of that, I'll say, I'm not sure that we did a good job growing it. We grew it 1 year in the field and never tried again. And if we had instead taken the time to learn from that experience and do it better, we might have had a better outcome. But we just started growing it in the tunnel.
And you got such great results. You might as well stick with that.
Absolutely.
So how do you space your Foxglove in the tunnels?
So we space this on 6x6, but actually next year, we're going to space it even closer. I think we're going to try 2 plants in each square of the netting because we really want that first stem. So it does do some regrowth, but we don't get as much money for those secondary stems as for the initial stem. And so just as long as, if it only makes 1 stem, that's really all we need. We want as many of that stem as possible. So we're going to try it instead of 4 per square foot, 8 per square foot. We don't know we may go back after that. We'll have to check in next year.
Yeah, we'll have to do a check-in. So you do it as cut and come again, but like you mentioned, the secondary stems are not as striking, dramatic as that first.
They're much smaller and there are not very many of them. I think each plant makes 1 or 2 of these very dramatic first stems. And then, it maybe makes 1 or 2 more of the smaller stems. They're beautiful, but they're not that impressive or significant for the business.
Right. Do you do successions of any of these Foxgloves?
We don't. We just plant them once over the winter.
And when do you have them available? When do they start blooming for you typically?
In April. I think the first stems were all done by the end of April. And then there was some secondary growth through May.
And how many stems overall do you expect to get per plant?
We got 3.5 stems per plant, but like I said, we really just want that first stem. And so we're going to see if we can get fewer stems per plant, but have more plants so we get more of that first stem.
And what stage do you like to harvest your foxglove at?
Same as snapdragons, with anywhere between one of the bottom florets just about to pop up to a few of them open. The flowers are very delicate, and so they can get bruised or knocked off easily. They get pollinated very quickly. They're so attractive to bumblebees. And so having them with fewer flowers open, we think is a better product.
All right, now we're moving on to Godetia, or you might know it as Clarkia. Why is this an important crop for your farm, Jonathan? And why is this worth the tunnel space?
Well, much to our surprise this year, we got more money per square foot of bed space for this crop than any other, which is not at all what we expected. So just based on that, it definitely makes the list.
Yeah. And which varieties do you like to grow? And describe what we're looking at here. It's so beautiful.
So this is the Grace series. It comes in 3 colors, white, lavender, and salmon, and actually a 4th color, shell pink, which is white with a pink interior. We grow the white and the lavender. We have tried to grow the salmon before, overwintered. I mean, it grows fine in the spring, but it blooms later, so we don't do that. And it's less cold hardy than the white and the lavender. So the last 2 years, the salmon died in a cold spell and the white and the lavender survived. So this year, we're just not growing it.
That's interesting. Do you notice any big differences growing this in the tunnel versus the field, if you've grown it in the field?
We have it's an incredibly dramatic difference in height. And the reason is this crop is very sensitive to day length and will bloom when the day length is where it wants it to be. I mean, you can push that back a little bit by planting like a spring succession, but it still is very responsive to day length. So when it's in a tunnel, it has a lot more warmth to grow tall before the day length gets to the point where it wants to bloom. When we grew it in the field, it just didn't grow tall enough because it was colder before it bloomed. So this is one we would definitely recommend growing in a tunnel, unless you're in an area with a very early cool spring, a very early warm spring, somewhere like maybe zone 9, something like that.
That's really good to know. So how do you space your Godetia?
Okay, so similar to the digitalis, this makes some really nice, several big stems per plant, and then they get much smaller. So we space it very, very close. 5 rows in a bed, and then 6 inches apart within the row with 2 layers of netting. It has to be netted 2 layers. So that's a similar spacing as to people might space Lisianthus.
And remind everyone how wide your beds are.
They're about 30 inches, 25 inches maybe at the top. So we're doing them like you might do Lisianthus. You might have a square that has 1, and then a square that has 2, and then a square that has 1, a square that has 2, like that.
So do you consider them cut and come again, or do you consider them more?
They're not. They bloom in a very short period of time. They all bloom at once, and then they're done.
So do you plant successions of this?
We don't. We have in the past planted a spring succession, but it just didn't bloom early enough to make sense for us.
So what is your overall bloom time for this flower?
April, I would say. I mean, I think that's a theme here. Lots of these things are blooming in April, which is our high wedding demand.
Yeah. And how many stems do you anticipate getting per plant?
We got 10 stems per plant. And then I'm looking at my notes here. It might be 5 stems per plant. I can't tell. I have 10 stems per plant and 5 bunches per foot, which doesn't add up.
Okay.
So 5 to 10 stems per plant, if it's netted. In the past, when we've done not such a good job netting it, we've lost over half the stems.
Oh, wow. That's a good point. So make sure to net it. And what stage do you like to harvest it at?
Okay, it opens incredibly quickly. So the ideal stage is when the calyx is cracked and you can see color, but the flower has not fully emerged. So like it was just a little lipstick sticking out of the bud.
Yeah. And just for one of the flowers on the
Just for one of the flowers on it, it will have multiple flowers per stem. So when one flower is cracked and you can see the color, that's the best time to harvest it.
Perfect. Okay, now we're going to move into 2 corm-grown crops, and we'll call these our honorary cool flowers. So we're talking about anemones first. And why are these such an important crop for your farm? And why are these worth the tunnel space, which we kind of mentioned before? You can't really grow these out in the field where you're located.
We can't. So these aren't really a cool flower. These require a Mediterranean kind of environment that you can replicate in a tunnel. And I think, except maybe down in Florida and California, people can't grow these in the field. These are not counting this year, the Godetia surprised us. These are consistently our most productive, most profitable crop. As you can see, they're just gorgeous. So we really love growing them.
They're beautiful. Which varieties do you like to grow?
We really like the Galilee series and the Rainbow series, and we're tending to grow not that many colors and larger quantities of colors that are in demand for weddings. So we actually primarily grow white, and then this one that you can see on the right in this picture, which is called Pastel Violet from the Rainbow series. It's just a beautiful white and sort of blush violet color that's very popular with designers.
And you grow this as an annual. Do you ever save the corms? Sometimes corms are patent protected and you can't even do that, but do you ever attempt to save the corms?
We don't know anyone that saves anemone corms. I think that's just not an easy thing to do.
So how do you space your anemones?
We do one every 6 inches.
And these are cut and come again for you?
They're cut and come again over a very long season. So they start blooming in mid-February. We can have them for Valentine's Day. And then we were still harvesting anemones at the end of May. It was a very cool spring. That's unusual, but we did do something experimental this year. Starting in March, we put shade cloth on the tunnel that had the anemones in it to keep the soil as cool as possible, because that as the soil warms up, they'll stop flowering. So we were very happy with that experiment, but these are cut and come again. And because they're so prolific and bloom over such a long period of time, that's one reason they're worth growing.
Do you plant successions, or do all the corms go in the ground at the same time?
We plant them all at once, about 3 weeks after our last frost date.
And so you said that you have them usually in February blooming, and this year was a cooler than normal spring, so they bloomed for a really long time. In a typical year, how long do they tend to go for you? Which depends on the weather, but...
It depends on the weather because the heat shuts them down. I would say typically they're done by Mother's Day, although this year they went through the end of May at very small amounts, but we still loved having them.
And how many stems do you expect to get off of an anemone plant?
We got 7 off of each plant last year.
Wow.
So, they're fairly expensive by the stem, so that really adds up, but it's worth planting them at a close spacing to get a lot of stems.
Yeah. And what stage do you like to harvest them at?
These are a little tricky to harvest, but there's a little gap that is between the anemone and the green collar below it. And when that's about 1/4 inch is when we harvest them.
Perfect. Okay. And our last crop we're going to be talking about is another corm grown crop, and it's Ranunculus. Why is this such an important crop to your farm? And this is another one you can't really grow in the field. So that's one of the main reasons to grow it in the tunnel.
Absolutely. And that's why we got a tunnel, actually, was to grow Ranunculus. And it's important because it's an expensive crop to sell. And there's, once again, virtually infinite demand for it. It's such a beautiful crop. It's so in demand for weddings that we just grow as much as we can.
And are there any particular varieties you like? Do you grow regular Ranunculus versus butterfly, or?
We've grown it all, but we would recommend people start with the regular Ranunculus that they can get from Edney. So that would be the Amandine series, the Labelle series, and the half clone series, because those are the cheapest corms. It is a little bit difficult to grow and prone to disease. And so you might as well start out with risking less. And they're just as beautiful as the others.
Yeah. Do you save Ranunculus corms at all, or do you buy new every year?
Sometimes we save them, sometimes we buy new ones. It just depends. It's time consuming to save them. So that's definitely one factor.
So how do you space Ranunculus plants in your tunnel?
Sort of normal Ranunculus, we space every 6 inches. Other Ranunculus might have its own spacing requirements.
And this is another cut and come again for you?
Yeah, it makes several stems. Each variety blooms over only a couple of weeks, but all the varieties bloom at different times. Even all the colors within the same series bloom at different times. So we have Ranunculus, depending on how warm we keep our tunnel, because it has that thermostat, we can control the temperature. It can start anywhere between the beginning of March to the end of March, and then it will bloom for about 6 weeks after that, 6 to 8 weeks after that.
And do you plant successions of Ranunculus?
We never have. We're going to experiment this year, but we've never done it before. So another one I'll have to check in on.
Yeah. And how many stems did you say you get per plant?
We got this year 3.5 stems per plant. I think that's lower than normal because we had some disease issues. So I would expect more in the 4 to 6 range. But even with 3.5, it was still a perfectly acceptable crop.
And what stage do you like to harvest Ranunculus for your purposes?
When you squish it and it's a little bit soft, sort of like a marshmallow before the petals have separated, is the best stage for selling to florists. At a farmer's market, I think you'd want it to be more open.
Okay, well, that rounded out our list of the 7 cool season annual crops Jonathan will be growing next year. I hope you all found that helpful and interesting and inspiring. And Jonathan, we mentioned in part 1 that in addition to farming and being a firefighter, you also have an on-demand online course called the No-Till Microscale Flower Farm. Could you just describe what that course entails and how it relates to your approach to farming and the methods that you actually practice out there on your farm?
So really, we talk about each of those things in the course, and we use a lot of context from our farm. So I'll just take them one at a time. No-till, I think no-till methods are gaining popularity. So we talk about our ways of doing no-till. We don't till at all in the tunnels, in the field. We have occasionally tilled lightly as a way to get cover crop seed incorporated. We do talk about that as well, but we just talk about our methods for no-till. We found that no-till methods for us, in combination with adding a lot of organic matter, has really revitalized the clay soil that we have. Additionally, on our farm scale, and I think this is really important for people who want to have a micro farm kind of farm business, no-till is an affordable and accessible way to do that business. Like, there's no justification for us to have a $20,000 tractor. We do have a BCS walk-behind tractor we use primarily because it's an awesome mower. The mowing implements on it are just incredibly robust. That's for managing cover crops. It would be possible even to do it without that. I would recommend, even though we're talking about no-till, some sort of either harrow or tiller for making beds new for the first time, like tearing up sod. But besides that, you really don't need any power equipment. And so, we do all our beds by hand. We don't use a broad fork even. I know a lot of people use a broad fork. We use a small sort of potato digging fork, which we just find works for our bodies better. We talk about that in our course. We talk about how we handle a lot of the material that people use for no-till and for flower farming, like landscape fabric, row cover, just how to use these things without driving yourself crazy. So that's the no-till section. Then we have the micro farm section. And I know I talked a little bit about our farm, but we feel really strongly that a flower farm is a farm because of the professional approach of the farmer, not because of the size, and definitely not because that person is stressed out working after dark with a headlamp or anything like that. We've both worked on large farms. We have a lot of friends who are farmers. We feel like there's a little bit of like machismo, like I'm more miserable than you sometimes in terms of how real of a farmer you are. And we just don't think that's what it needs to be like. We know people who grow flower farms, who grow flowers in 3 or 4 beds. They do a 20-person, 20-week CSA. That's the only thing they do. They do it really well. And that kind of approach is accessible to someone who wants to grow flowers in a city, who has a typical suburban home. Someone who has a lot of land like us could also do that. I mean, it really broadens and invites more people to be growing flowers, selling local flowers, in creating a market for local flowers. What we really think is important is that people are approaching that as if they were a farmer on whatever size they are, right, not as if they were just gardening as a hobby. So that means growing the right crops, harvesting them at the right stage, having access to a cooler, probably different things that are basically going to end up with a professional quality product, and then taking pride in that as a farmer. But we really think that vision is accessible on any scale. We're doing it in these 4 covered spaces and some extra beds outside that total an acre. But, we would be able to do it on less land than that if we had different goals and different ambitions and a different space. Yeah. I think that's what we're talking about with the micro farm. Also, how to set your farm up, tips for laying your farm out to make it easier, tips for selling your flowers, tips for flower selection, and thinking about your business. So for example, a micro farm really does lend itself to a short flower season. Whatever season makes sense for you in your geographical context. It's going to be very different, of course, if you're like in, growing near Aspen, Colorado, or even growing in the mountains of North Carolina versus growing on the coast of North Carolina. So, but it does lend itself to that short season, which I think is also attractive, especially to families. I think that our farm right now is basically the largest that we would consider a micro farm. And that's part of our motivation for really making it smaller, making it more fit in with the life that we want. And really anybody can do that. It does take time, improving the soil takes time, developing markets take time, learning when to cut your flowers, how to cut your flowers. That takes time. It takes a few seasons. Takes, every time, whenever we started growing a new flower, it would take us a few seasons to really get to know it. So that's the micro farm part. And then flower farm, and we're a flower farm. I think most people who take that class are flower farmers, although anyone who wanted to take it to improve their gardening or even to think about a micro vegetable farm, I think it might still have some application. But so in the flower farming part, we talk about tools that you might want. We talk about stage of harvest. We are very, very picky about the stage of harvest for our flowers. Selling to florists, I think we cut our flowers a lot less open than most people because we want to be able to hold it for a week in our cooler. And then we expect them, if we sell it to them on a Wednesday, they may hold it until Saturday. Right. And then their final customer should still get a long vase life out of it. And so, we have selected our flowers in part to be conducive to that schedule because we can harvest something on a Wednesday. Well, we're not going to sell it till the next Tuesday because that's the day that we do our deliveries. But we want to pick it at the right stage so it's not pollinated inappropriately. And not every flower, but most of the flowers we grow continue to open once they're harvested. So it's just knowing that and experimenting with that. We do vase trials all the time. We do storage trials all the time. Like we've stored flowers for 3 or 4 weeks in our cooler, taken them out, put them on our counter, seen how long they last, seen what their color is because the color can change with storage. We talk about things like that in the flower farming section of the course. So it's really comprehensive. It's about 4 hours, I think. And it's an on-demand course, so people can take it anytime. And then once a year in the winter, we do a live Q&A. But there is a Facebook group for people who've taken the course that people can post questions on, and other students will answer, or I'll jump in and answer. So we have some discussions there as well. We're really proud of it. We think it really captures a lot of the information that we think makes this farm work for us. And we're passionate about this approach to farming and making the farm fit into the life that you want rather than building your life around the whims of the farm and letting the farm dictate everything about your life.
Yeah, I think that's very encouraging to a lot of people that you can have a successful flower farm. You can build a successful flower farm that fits into your lifestyle, not the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, that was it for this episode of Seed Talk. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for being here and being so generous and sharing all this information with us. It was so fun having you on. And the link to Jonathan and his wife Megan's course is going to be in the show notes. They're full of information, as I'm sure you can tell, so be sure to check that out. You can also connect with Jonathan and Megan at Springforth Farm NC on Instagram or Facebook, or springforthfarmnc.com.
Thank you very much, Layne. Have a great day.
Okay, you too. And remember, everyone, to subscribe or follow wherever you're listening to this so you won't miss any episodes. So thanks, everyone. And until we meet again, bye.
Bye.